A black executive, fresh from closing the biggest deal of his career, steps into a luxury hotel expecting nothing more than a quiet evening before his flight home. But before he can even check in, everything changes. A hotel manager, uneasy with his presence, questions his reservation, dismissing him, humiliating him in front of guests. And just 10 minutes later, the same manager is being escorted out in disgrace. What happened next sent shockwaves through the hotel industry, exposing a truth many refused to acknowledge. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe stories like this matter, hit subscribe so you never miss another one. It started as just an ordinary night. The plane hummed with the dull murmur of routine. Passengers settled into their seats with the practiced ease of those who had done this before. A man in a stiff suit checked his watch with the air of someone whose time was worth more than most. A mother wrangled her child into place, already exhausted before the flight had begun. The scent of coffee, expensive cologne, and recycled air mingled into something both sterile and deeply human. And then she stepped in. Naomi Porter moved with the kind of grace that was quiet, unhurried. She did not stomp nor glide. She simply existed in space the way one does when they know they have a right to be there. She was dressed in deep blue, her skirt pressed, her heels clicking softly against the cabin floor. Not a hair out of place. Not a trace of hesitation. But it was there, waiting for her. That moment, that shift, that silent but thunderous pause. It was not something you could see. Not something one could point to. But you felt it if you had ever lived inside a skin like hers. A hesitation, imperceptible to some, that ran through the body of the flight attendant standing by the first-class cabin. Just a flicker of the eyes. A slight tension in the jaw. So quick, so expertly contained that it almost seemed natural. Almost. Naomi saw it. She always did. She reached her row in the first-class section, set her handbag down, and placed her ticket in the seat back pocket. A man across the aisle glanced at her, then away, as though pretending not to have noticed her at all. A woman one row ahead adjusted in her seat, casually looking back as if she were just stretching. Nothing direct, nothing hostile. And yet, everything was happening. The flight attendant was upon her before she had fully settled. A bright, polite smile stretched across her face. Too tight, too forced. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, voice light, lilting. "I believe there's been a mix-up." Naomi met her gaze, steady. The same conversation, the same script. "No mix-up," she said smoothly. "This is my seat." The attendant hesitated. A thin veil of professionalism masked her discomfort. But it was there, struggling beneath the surface. She glanced down at the clipboard she had been clutching, her fingers pressing too hard into the laminated pages. "I see," she murmured, but her tone betrayed her. She did not see. She did not believe it. And she did not want to believe it. Naomi watched the internal struggle play out. As she had many times before, the flight attendant was fighting against something unspoken. An unexamined truth that had lived in her for too long. That a black woman does not belong here. Not in this way. Not with this ease. The flight attendant cleared her throat. "Would you mind showing me your boarding pass?" Just to confirm. It was not an unreasonable request. Not on the surface. But it was not just a request. It was a test. And Naomi had been tested enough. She did not sign, though she wanted to. She did not roll her eyes, though she had earned that right. Instead, she reached into her pocket and retrieved the pass. Handing it over with careful, deliberate grace, she gave it the way she always gave it. To say, "I will do this. But I am not obligated to. I am humoring you." The woman's eyes flickered as she read the ticket, her cheeks tightening with something that might have been embarrassment. If embarrassment had room to exist in someone who did not believe they were wrong in the first place. "Well," the flight attendant said, tone shifting. "Thank you. I just had to be sure." The moment was over. But it was never over. Naomi tucked her boarding pass away, settled into her seat, and turned her gaze toward the window. The flight attendant moved on, the tension in her shoulders unraveling as she put distance between them. But the damage had been done. Because now the whispers began. The curious glances. The unspoken "what was that about?" that lived just beneath the surface of every expression. It was never about the seat. It was about who had taken the seat. And before the flight was over, everyone on that plane would understand why that mattered. Even the flight attendant. The plane had not yet left the ground. But already, it had taken flight in a way that had nothing to do with altitude. Naomi sat still, hands resting lightly in her lap. She did not move to adjust the air vent. Did not check her phone. Did not shift in her seat. She knew the game well enough to understand that movement could be misinterpreted. That any adjustment, a sigh, a glance too sharp, a flicker of impatience, might be seen as something else. And so, she simply was. But that was never enough. Across the aisle, an older man, perhaps in his 70s, turned his head just slightly, pretending to look past her while his eyes flicked toward her seat. He had been watching since the moment the flight attendant had left. Not openly, not aggressively, but watching nonetheless. Beside him, his wife, a woman with silver hair arranged in careful, practiced waves, leaned in, whispering something behind her hand. The words were lost beneath the ambient hum of the plane. But Naomi didn't need to hear them. She knew. It was the same whisper exchanged in restaurants when she walked into a room that certain people assumed she would never enter. The same glance that passed between couples at high-end department stores. As if she were both invisible and yet suddenly, inexplicably, the most watched person in the room. Not a person, a presence. Naomi was used to this. She was tired of being used to it. The flight continued to board. Row after row filling. The aisles narrowing with movement. A businessman with tired eyes shuffled past. Already scrolling through emails. A teenage girl in an oversized sweatshirt bumped into an armrest and muttered an apology no one acknowledged. The everyday rhythm of travel. Its small indignities and quiet accommodations. Played out around her. Then, it happened again. A different flight attendant, this one younger, less rigid, approached her row. He hesitated just a fraction too long before speaking. That pause. That terrible, familiar pause. Ma'am, he stopped. Clearing his throat. Would you mind switching seats? We have a couple in economy who got separated. And it would be really helpful if. Quote. No. Naomi did not say it aloud. But it rang in her head like a bell. No. She had seen it before. This particular brand of performance. The request wrapped in politeness. Packaged in "we would really appreciate it." Folded neatly inside the assumption that she was the one who should move. She had watched it play out 100 different ways. A white woman, seated elsewhere, would have been asked. A white man in her place would have been given options. But Naomi? Naomi was being given an opportunity to comply. She smiled, slow and knowing. I booked this seat. I'd like to keep it. The flight attendant shifted his weight. Clearly uncomfortable. Of course. I just thought. Quote. What did you think? A second of hesitation. He opened his mouth. Then shut it again. The man across the aisle. The one who had been watching. Turned his gaze toward the window. His wife pursed her lips. It's just a favor. The flight attendant finally mumbled. Backing away. A favor. As if she owed something to people she had never met. As if her presence here, in this seat, in this moment, had been an oversight that should be corrected through quiet, voluntary departure. The whispers began again. Someone 2 rows ahead leaned closer to their companion, murmuring under their breath. A younger man in business attire peered up from his phone. It was subtle, but no longer ignorable. Naomi was being watched. She exhaled slowly, turned her gaze toward the window, and willed herself to ignore it. But she could feel it building. The same way a storm brews before it breaks. The plane had not yet lifted from the ground. But Naomi felt it moving. Not in the way the engines hummed or the lights flickered overhead. But in the way the air around her had shifted. Had thickened. Had turned into something else. She had seen this before. She had felt it in the quiet, measured steps of a security guard following her in a department store. Moving just close enough to be seen. But never close enough to be confronted. She had felt it in the uneasy pause of a cab driver's foot on the gas pedal. Lingering just long enough to decide whether to stop for her at all. She had felt it in the forced pleasantries of the landlord who told her, "We'll get back to you," though she knew they never would. It was the moment just before something was said. Or done. The moment when discomfort no longer remained silent. The second flight attendant, the one who had asked her to move, stood near the front of the cabin now, whispering to the first. Lisa. Naomi watched as their eyes flicked toward her. Then away. Their conversation hushed but urgent. This was what they did not say. Should we do something? Was she rude? She should have just moved. It's not a big deal. I didn't expect her to say no. I don't know. She just has a tone. Naomi had heard these conversations her entire life. Sometimes whispered, sometimes spoken aloud, always in spaces where her presence was questioned. But now it was shifting. It was no longer just a quiet thing. No longer a silent game of glances and unspoken words. Now, others were starting to take notice. A man 3 rows ahead. A businessman, mid-40s, pale fingers tapping on his phone, turned and looked at her. His expression unreadable. The older man across the aisle, the one who had watched from the beginning, cleared his throat. Lisa turned on her heel, straightened her uniform, and walked toward Naomi's row. And then, it happened. The thing that always happens. Ma'am, Lisa said, with a practiced smile, the kind of smile that comes before an insult. The kind of smile white women have been using for centuries. Naomi did not return it. We're going to need you to move. Naomi blinked. Slow. I already told your colleague. I booked this seat. Lisa's expression barely shifted, but something sharpened at the edges. I understand that, but we're asking as a courtesy. There's a guest in economy who. Quote. Did I book a courtesy? Naomi asked, her voice measured. Or did I book a seat? Lisa inhaled sharply, her grip tightening around the clipboard she didn't really need to hold. Naomi could hear it, the slight shift in tone. The subtle shift from professionalism to something colder. This is a request, ma'am. And there it was. The shift. It was no longer about the seat. It was about control. The businessman 3 rows ahead looked back again. The older man across the aisle tensed. The air inside the cabin turned sharp. Are you asking anyone else to move? Naomi asked. Lisa hesitated, a fraction of a second too long. And that was all Naomi needed to know. She leaned back, exhaled through her nose. No, I won't be moving. Lisa's face stiffened. The tension, the real tension, had arrived. Naomi had seen it before. In restaurants where the check took too long to arrive. In boardrooms where her ideas were too aggressive. In classrooms where her intelligence was mistaken for arrogance. The moment when the situation transformed from a misunderstanding into an offense. Lisa stood there, clipboard clutched to her chest. Her breath coming just a little quicker. Naomi had seen that too. That moment when someone realized they weren't in control anymore. But before Lisa could say anything else, a voice cut through the air. A man's voice. Low, steady. I think there's been enough of this. The entire plane seemed to turn toward the sound. And Naomi knew, before she even looked up, that the real battle had just begun. The voice that cut through the air was measured. Deliberate. Just deep enough to carry. Just soft enough to unsettle. I think there's been enough of this. Naomi turned her head slowly, already knowing who she would find. The man in the sharp suit. She had seen him before. Earlier, when she first stepped onto the plane. He had looked at her. Not in the way the others had. Not in that quiet, condescending appraisal, but with something else. Something calculating. Something waiting. He was tall, with skin the color of polished mahogany. His posture precise. His hands resting easily on the armrests of his first-class seat. He did not fidget. He did not glance around, searching for approval or permission. He simply was. The flight attendant, Lisa, turned toward him, the professional mask slipping just slightly. Sir, this doesn't concern you. The man smiled, just a flicker of amusement. Something restrained, something deadly. It does now. And just like that, the game changed. Lisa hesitated, clipboard pressed too tightly to her chest. Naomi knew what was happening. Knew it before Lisa even spoke. This was not just about control anymore. This was about losing it. Lisa was used to dealing with people like Naomi. People who knew they were being treated unfairly but who also knew, deep in their bones, that there was a cost to pushing back. People who were used to swallowing their pride because it was easier than making a scene. But this man? This man was something else entirely. Lisa straightened her spine, clinging to authority. Sir, I'm handling this. The man gave a slow, measured nod. No, you're trying to handle it. And now I'm curious. Why? Lisa's mouth pressed into a thin line. I don't have to explain myself to you. No, he said, but you will. And there it was again. That shift. That terrible, familiar shift. This was not a conversation anymore. This was a reckoning. The businessman 3 rows ahead had put his phone down. The older man across the aisle had gone still. The whispers were back, stronger now, moving through the cabin like an approaching storm. Lisa looked around, eyes darting as if she were searching for someone to intervene, to back her up, to save her from the moment she had created. But no one came. She had pushed too far. And now, everyone was watching. Naomi sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. She had spent a lifetime navigating moments like this. The difference was, this time, someone had stepped in. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt something sharper, because she knew what was coming next. Lisa exhaled sharply, her face tight. I don't see why this is an issue, she said, her voice brittle. I was just trying to resolve the seating confusion. The man in the suit tilted his head. Confusion? Lisa blinked. Was she sitting in the wrong seat? He asked. Voice smooth, patient. Lisa hesitated. No, but, quote, was there a problem with her boarding pass? Lisa's breath caught. No. The man nodded. Then what, exactly, was the problem? Lisa opened her mouth. No words came. And now, the silence was loud. The businessman shifted uncomfortably. The older man across the aisle crossed his arms. Somewhere in the back, someone coughed. Naomi let the silence stretch. Let it linger. Because the truth was here now. Because now, there was nothing left for Lisa to hide behind. Lisa swallowed, her fingers flexing against the clipboard. I was just following protocol, she muttered. The man in the suit smiled again. Not kind, not cruel, just knowing. Well, he said, that's the problem, isn't it? Lisa's breath hitched. The man didn't look at Naomi. Not once. Because he didn't have to. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about something bigger. And Lisa knew it. And Lisa feared it. Naomi watched as Lisa took a step back. Then another, her authority crumbling beneath the weight of all the eyes on her. She turned stiffly, walked away. Not quickly, but not slowly either. Just far enough to retreat. Just far enough to escape. Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The storm had not passed. But it had shifted. And for the first time, someone else had been forced to feel its weight. Lisa did not return. For the first time since Naomi had stepped onto the plane. The air felt still. Not calm. Never calm. But suspended. Like the moment before a storm decides whether it will break or simply gather itself for something worse. The flight was now preparing for takeoff. But something deeper had already taken flight in that cabin. The hush that followed Lisa's retreat was not one of peace. It was the silence of a wound too fresh to be spoken about. Too deep to be ignored. The businessman 3 rows ahead shifted in his seat, glancing at Naomi, then quickly away, as though afraid of what he might find if he looked too long. The older man across the aisle, the one who had been watching all along, adjusted in his seat, cleared his throat, and then said, quietly, well, she could have just moved. It was almost an afterthought, tossed into the air like a match on dry grass. Naomi turned her head slowly, deliberately, locking eyes with him, and there it was. Not hostility, not anger, just certainty. A certainty that was older than this plane. Older than these seats. Older than him. A certainty that whispered, we built the world this way. And it has worked for us. Naomi had seen this man before. Not in the flesh. Not in this exact seat. But in every moment like this. In every town. Every city. Every whispered conversation that started with I don't see the problem and ended with her being asked. Politely. Always politely. To disappear. She could have answered him. She could have explained, carefully, that her seat was not the point. That what had happened was not about kindness or courtesy. But about something far older and uglier. But explanations were exhausting, and she had nothing left to give him. So she simply smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly, and turned away. The silence that followed was different from before. Now, he was the one being watched. And he knew it. The plane jolted forward, rolling toward the runway. The engines rumbled beneath them. A deep, pulsing force that filled the air, vibrating through the seats. Naomi inhaled deeply, staring out the window. She knew better than to think it was over. Because it never was. The man in the sharp suit, the one who had spoken up, had returned to his reading. His posture still, his expression unreadable. He had not turned to her, had not tried to congratulate himself for speaking, had not offered some smug little glance that said, "See what I did for you." And for that, Naomi was grateful. She did not need rescuing. She needed witnesses. And that was what he had been. A witness. Not a savior. Not a martyr. Just someone who had decided that today, in this moment, he would not look away. The plane lifted off the ground. Naomi closed her eyes, just for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle into her bones. The air had changed, but the world had not. And the flight was far from over. The plane had taken off. But gravity still held firm inside the cabin. No one spoke of what had happened. Not the businessman 3 rows ahead, who had been so eager to watch but too afraid to be seen. Not the older man across the aisle, who now kept his gaze locked firmly on the seat back in front of him, as though looking anywhere else might pull him into something he did not wish to acknowledge. Not even Lisa, who had vanished into the galley, swallowed by the narrow corridor, leaving behind only the ghost of her mistake. And yet, Naomi felt it in the air, thick and pressing. She had been seen, not in the way she had chosen, not for her dignity, her presence, or the simple right to take up space, but seen in the way black women are always seen, when they refuse to yield, when they refuse to shrink, when they refuse to make things easy. And there was a price for that. She knew it before the whispers started. It began small, in the way it always did. The businessman shifted in his seat, leaning just a fraction closer to the woman beside him. The woman nodding, whispering something in return. Their conversation hushed, furtive, a glance, a murmur, a slight turn of the head, as if confirming something unspoken. The older man across the aisle sighed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with enough weight to say, she should have just let it go. And then, the first ripple, a young flight attendant, different from Lisa, approached Naomi's row, her expression cautious. "Ma'am," she said softly, "can I get you anything?" It was a simple question. A professional one, a normal one. But Naomi saw the lie in it. The girl had not come to serve her. She had come to check on her. To assess. To ensure she wasn't angry. Wasn't dangerous. Wasn't, God forbid, about to make a bigger scene. Naomi smiled, not out of kindness but out of understanding. "I'm fine," she said, letting the words settle. The flight attendant hesitated, as if there was something else she had wanted to say. Something unspoken hanging between them. But she only nodded, retreating back down the aisle. Naomi exhaled. She had seen this before. First, the moment of resistance. Then, the silence. Then, the whispers. And finally, the slow, creeping question. Was she the problem all along? Because that was how it worked. It was not about what had happened. It was about how people felt about what had happened. And people did not like to feel uncomfortable. They did not like to be forced to witness what they would rather ignore. So they wrote it, softened the edges, made it into something else entirely. And soon, Naomi knew, she would no longer be the woman who had been asked to move. She would be the woman who had caused a disruption. The man in the sharp suit had not moved since he had spoken. He remained still, his hands folded neatly over the tray table in front of him. His gaze cast forward, unbothered. But Naomi knew he wasn't unbothered. He had spoken up, and in doing so, had broken the same rule she had. He had been visible, and visibility had consequences. His presence had shifted things, turned the moment into something larger, more undeniable. He had made it real. And because of that, he, too, was being watched. Naomi saw it in the way Lisa re-emerged, peering toward first class, pretending to be adjusting something on the service cart but really just looking. She saw it in the way the businessman up ahead kept stealing glances at the man's crisp suit, his expensive watch, the straightness of his shoulders, as though trying to determine where he fit in this unspoken order. And she saw it in the way the woman beside the businessman leaned in and whispered, voice just low enough not to be heard, but just loud enough to be felt. The weight had shifted, not just onto her, but onto him, and now, he would have to decide. Would he remain a witness? Or would he return to silence? Naomi did not look at him. She did not need to. Because she already knew the answer. The same way she had always known. The hum of the engines filled the cabin. Steady, relentless. The plane was in the air now, cutting through clouds, pushing forward. But inside, something else was happening. The moment was shifting, being rewritten. Naomi could feel it. The way a person feels the shift in the wind before the storm finally breaks. Because it was not about the facts. It was never about the facts. It was about who got to tell the story. She saw it in the way the whispers moved, passed from row to row like a current, like a fever, like something spreading without a source. She saw it in the way Lisa stood by the service cart now. Chin high, eyes forward, a woman regaining her power. She had retreated, yes. But retreat was not surrender. Lisa had learned something today. Learned that her authority, so easily wielded, could be questioned, that she could be held in place by words, by silence, by the unbearable weight of an audience watching too closely. And Lisa was not the kind of woman who let such a lesson sit quietly inside her. She was rewriting it. Naomi had seen it before. The way a person, confronted with their own bias, their own misstep, would refuse to let it settle, would twist it into something else, something that made them the real victim. She could feel it happening already. The slow turning of the moment. Lisa had not been wrong. Lisa had simply been misunderstood. Lisa had only been trying to help. Lisa had been attacked by a woman with an attitude. By one of those women. Naomi had seen it play out 1,000 times. In coffee shops. In department stores. In meetings where she had spoken with authority only to be met with narrowed eyes and the quiet accusation. Why are you so aggressive? Now, it was happening here, at 30.000 feet. Lisa had returned to the front of the plane. Near the first-class section, her back was straight, her expression composed, but Naomi could see the tension in her fingers. The way they gripped the edge of the service cart, pressing against it like a woman pressing down a memory she did not want to keep. And then, it happened. A man, seated just a few rows ahead, leaned toward her, older, white, with a neatly pressed shirt and the careful posture of someone who believed in the rules. I saw what happened back there, he murmured, low enough that only Lisa would hear. Lisa glanced at him. The first flicker of relief crossed her face. She was being difficult, he continued, shaking his head. You were just doing your job. And just like that, Lisa was absolved. The older man across the aisle, the one who had said she could have just moved, nodded slightly. The woman beside the businessman, the one who had been whispering since takeoff, turned slightly in her seat. Her lips pressed into a thin, knowing line. Naomi exhaled. And there it was. The moment no longer belonged to her. The discomfort had been too much. The weight of the truth too unbearable. So they had rewritten it. Not with malice, not with anger, but with the quiet insistence that the world must remain as they understood it. A black woman refusing to move? That was a conflict. That was difficult. That was unnecessary trouble. A white flight attendant correcting a mistake? That was just protocol. And so, the weight shifted again. Lisa, who had faltered, who had been questioned, was now restored. Naomi, who had merely existed, was now the problem. She had seen it before. She had felt it before. She had lived inside it for years. And yet, it still stung. Because this was how history worked. It was not rewritten in books. It was rewritten in real time. In the space between truth and comfort. In the slow, careful way people chose to remember things differently. It was rewritten in the white man leaning in to tell Lisa she had done nothing wrong. It was rewritten in the whispers. In the turned heads. In the sidelong glances. It was rewritten in the way people would walk off this flight and say, something happened, but it wasn't a big deal. And Naomi? Naomi would step off this plane knowing that the story had already been taken from her. That it had been reshaped before it ever had the chance to fully exist. The man in the sharp suit had not spoken again. He had not needed to. Because he had seen it, too. And Naomi understood now. His silence was not retreat. It was study. He was waiting. Not to stop what was happening. But to see how far it would go. Because he understood something Naomi had long since learned. The problem was not the moment itself. The problem was the way people would convince themselves, by the time they landed, that it had never even happened. The plane began its descent. The captain's voice hummed over the intercom, distant and impersonal, announcing the weather at their destination, the expected arrival time, the customary, "We thank you for flying with us today." The kind of message designed to smooth over everything, to return the world to normal. But nothing felt normal to Naomi. Because she had watched the truth dissolve. She had watched it be carefully, precisely reshaped into something else. Into something easier, something lighter, something more comfortable for those who needed it to be. Lisa was composed again. The businessman 3 rows ahead had returned to his phone. The older man across the aisle had stopped watching. The couple who had whispered to each other sat back, satisfied. And yet, Naomi could feel them all still thinking about her. Still defining her in their own minds. Still settling on the version of the story they would take with them when they stepped off this plane and into the world. That was the final burden. Wasn't it? Not just the experience itself. But the knowledge that by the time they touched the ground, the moment would belong to them. Not to her. That was the final cruelty. The man in the sharp suit had not moved. Not when Lisa reclaimed her authority. Not when the older man gave his silent verdict. Not when the whispers twisted the moment into something it was never meant to be. He had simply watched. But now, as the plane descended through the clouds, as the world outside grew clearer, sharper, more real, he moved. He pressed the flight attendant call button. The light above his seat flickered on. A small, deliberate signal. Lisa hesitated before approaching. "Can I help you, sir?" Her voice was polite, controlled, relieved. Because the flight was ending. Because this will be over soon. Because nothing more could happen here. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. And then, finally, he spoke. "I'd like to file a complaint." Lisa stiffened. "Oh," she said, caught off guard. "About what?" The man exhaled, slow and even. "You already know," he said. The words were quiet, measured. Lisa's mouth opened, then shut again. The older man across the aisle turned. Just slightly. The businessman paused mid-scroll. Naomi did not move. She only watched. And now, Lisa was the one being seen. She swallowed. I can get you a form." Quote. "No need," the man said smoothly. "I'll be speaking to someone in your corporate office directly." Lisa's hands tightened around the back of the seat. The silence in the cabin was not the same as before. This was different. This was a silence that carried weight. Because this was not how the story was supposed to end. Lisa had been ready for closure. For the plane to land. For Naomi to disappear into the crowd. For the discomfort of the moment to evaporate into the air. But now, someone was refusing to let it fade. Now, someone had spoken into the quiet and given it shape again. Lisa inhaled sharply. "Siri." Quote. He lifted a hand. A small gesture. Dismissive. "I'm not interested in an apology," he said, voice cool. And Naomi understood. In that moment, what he was doing. He was not fixing anything. He was recording it. He was pressing the weight of his name, his presence, his power, against the moment, making it impossible to rewrite. Because that was the only way to win against silence. To force it to be remembered. Lisa nodded stiffly and walked away. Her steps too quick. Her composure slightly cracked. And Naomi? Naomi exhaled. Because for the first time, she realized, she had not been fighting to win. She had been fighting to be witnessed. And someone had seen her. The plane landed. The seatbelt sign dinged. People stood, stretching, gathering their belongings. slipping back into the lives they had lived before takeoff. For them, the flight was over. For Naomi, it never would be. Because she had lived a version of this flight before. She had sat in the wrong seat. She had been asked to move. She had heard the whispers. She had watched the story get rewritten in real time. The only thing that had ever changed was who was watching. And this time, someone had decided not to look away. It was a small thing. It would not change the world. It would not undo the hundreds of other flights. The thousands of other moments where she had been made to feel like she did not belong. But for once, just once, someone had spoken up, and the weight had been shifted. Even if just for a moment. Naomi stood, smoothed out her dress, and took one last look at the first-class cabin before stepping off the plane. She knew what they would say about her when she was gone. But she also knew the man in the sharp suit would be telling his version of the story, too. And for once, that was enough.